So for the heavyweight champion of the world in the UFC to be getting paid what he was getting paid was atrocious.
How crazy is this game? How crazy is this game?
It's one of those ones where you just sit here for like the next week going, what the happened there, you know?
23 years in, and the UFC's biggest stars are finally breaking their silence. When Sean Strickland pulled off that insane upset against Israel Adesanya, nobody could have predicted the chaos that would follow. We're talking explosive claims against Dana White, mind-blowing pay revelations, and insider secrets about what really goes down behind the scenes at the world's most powerful MMA promotion.
Would you say this is one of the biggest upsets in the history?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Australia, the two biggest upsets ever in the men's and women's division has happened in Australia. Israel looked like he was in slow motion. He looked like he couldn't get off. He looked like he was really stiff tonight. He looked very slow.
The upset that changed everything. Let me take you back to September 2023 to Sydney, Australia, where one night completely shifted the middleweight landscape and sparked a controversy that's still raging today. UFC 2093 was meant to be Israel Adesanya's big homecoming, a dominant title defense against a challenger that Dana White himself reportedly never believed belonged in there. Everyone expected another masterclass from the last stylebender, another highlight reel moment for the history books.
Number one is, this is what sport makes the most money. Number one is Formula One. They make almost $11 million a year.
Did you catch that bombshell revelation? Let me break down exactly what Israel Adesanya just confessed, because this changes everything. Dana White, the guy who built his empire preaching that fighters should always be ready to compete, that the best rise through constant battle, actively tried to talk his own champion out of taking a fight. Think about how massive that admission really is. This is the same person who spent decades telling us UFC fighters are independent contractors who earn what they deserve. The same executive who's brushed off pay complaints by highlighting the opportunities his company creates. Yet when one of his most valuable, marketable champions wanted to step in and fight, White basically said, "You've got enough money, don't risk it. Just take a break."
Yeah, it was like, you know, after my first UFC fight where I made 6-6, all my friends thought I was a millionaire because I was on TV in the UFC. They're like, "You're a UFC fighter, you're a millionaire now."
You made 12 grand.
I made 12 grand. And I paid out like 6 or 7 just to my coaches and
taxes.
And taxes.
Right, exactly.
So, you know, I had like 6 or 7 left over, and I had like 20 of my closest friends from high school, and you know, I picked up a check. It was like $2,000 or $3,000 dinner, and then I'm like, "What the fuck, dude? My whole paycheck's gone now."
But what's the real story here? Why would Dana White want to shield Adesanya from Sean Strickland? The truth, like everything in this business, boils down to money and strategy. Based on insider reports that surfaced after that shocking night, this was all about protecting profits. Adesanya represented the golden goose of the middleweight division, a fighter whose star power and mainstream appeal made him incredibly valuable to the bottom line. Losing to someone like Strickland, who the UFC allegedly worried might damage their brand with his controversial statements and unfiltered opinions that sponsors hate, could destroy that carefully crafted image. Plus, there was a bigger payday waiting, a matchup against Duplessis that White knew would generate way more revenue, more pay-per-view sales, more mainstream buzz. By telling Adesanya to chill out, White was essentially asking his champion to wait on the sidelines for the fight that would make the company the most cash, regardless of what Adesanya actually wanted.
How do you feel about how the Francis situation has been handled?
Dana said they're having dinner. They had dinner before he went to Cameroon. And I feel that's a good first step, definitely. I don't know what was said. I haven't talked to Francis yet, but that's their business. And I felt like some of the stuff that was happening before the Francis fight, I was not a fan of. I just felt like certain things should, like I said, this is business, man. You can't get too personal. It's business, and money is always around.
But Israel Adesanya went stubborn, as he put it so perfectly. He was determined to fight in Sydney to perform for his fans in that region. He refused to let business calculations control his fighting career. That choice would end up destroying his championship reign completely.
I've got teammates who are at that level in the UFC, and I know what some of them have to go through to make ends meet. So I feel like this is like the NBA of fighting, man, the NFL of fighting. Like, or not just MMA, or fighting. I really think so. So I feel like we shouldn't have to have, rookies, if you will. In the NBA, the rookies, they get nice checks. They don't have a second job. So why does, Joe Blow have to have a second job or a third job or have to scrounge for pennies for his next camp or whatever. I feel like
What you're seeing here is Dana White at UFC 2093, trying to process what he'd later call one of the most shocking upsets in UFC history. Sean Strickland, the guy who wasn't supposed to be champion, the fighter many thought had no business sharing the octagon with Israel Adesanya, completely dismantled the middleweight king in a way nobody predicted. The numbers tell the whole story. Strickland connected on 53% of his strikes, while Adesanya managed just 34%, systematically breaking down a champion who looked, in White's own confused words, really stiff and really slow.
Right now, life is good. I got money. I got a belt, dude. Everything is good. But like, you couldn't pay me to go relive my life. Like, you said, hey, Sean, you want to go hit the restart button? Like,
Here's where this gets truly fascinating, though. While the sports world was still trying to understand this monumental upset, Sean Strickland was getting ready for a completely different kind of battle, a war against the very system that had just made him champion. Strickland wasn't just training to beat Israel Adesanya in the cage. He'd been building a case against the UFC's entire pay structure, collecting evidence, and now with that championship belt around his waist, he finally had the platform and credibility to speak out on the biggest stage possible. After his historic win, Strickland started dropping absolute bombs about fighter pay that made headlines worldwide. He's consistently called UFC fighter compensation shocking, garbage, and even criminal, arguing that athletes get a ridiculously small piece of the revenue pie, roughly 16 to 20% compared to what company executives pocket. Let me put that devastating figure in context. NBA players get about 50% of league revenue through their collective bargaining. NFL players get around 48%. Major League Baseball has similar numbers. But in the UFC, the promotion that claims to be the premier combat sports organization on Earth, fighters take home less than 1/5 of what the company makes from their blood, sweat, broken bones, and brain damage. Strickland was determined to make sure everyone understood exactly what that meant. Things got even more explosive when details came out about Strickland's pay for his next fight. After becoming middleweight champion by beating one of the most accomplished fighters in UFC history, after pulling off one of the greatest upsets ever witnessed, Sean Strickland was reportedly offered just $200,000 base pay to fight Paulo Costa at UFC. According to his own social media posts, when fans guessed his purse, Strickland confirmed it was close to $200 to show, $200 to win, but actually way less. Picture this. A reigning champion coming off the biggest upset victory the sport has seen, getting offered what amounts to pocket change in professional sports. And Strickland wasn't staying quiet about any of it. In a brutally honest, expletive-filled interview with Daniel Cormier before UFC 302, the champion absolutely destroyed Dana White and the UFC's pay structure, pointing out specific examples of the massive gap between executive profits and fighter earnings. He didn't hold back, didn't sugarcoat anything, and clearly didn't care about potential career consequences. The most damaging revelation came when Strickland learned something that put the entire fighter pay debate in stark perspective. In a conversation that went viral, Strickland expressed genuine shock discovering that former fighter Quintet Rampage Jackson had earned $7 million from one fight against Chuck Liddell thanks to a favorable pay-per-view deal from before Dana White's complete control. $7 million from a single fight under the old system that White systematically destroyed. Then Strickland revealed something even more explosive. His own lawyer had secured a similar deal that White was legally forced to honor. This wasn't just complaining from an unhappy fighter. Strickland was showing actual proof that modern UFC contracts systematically undervalue fighters compared to deals that existed in the organization's earlier days. To really grasp the scope of what Sean Strickland and others have been fighting against, we need to examine the UFC's pay structure and the mechanisms that have kept fighter compensation down for decades. The fighter pay conflict isn't just about individual negotiations or personal issues with Dana White. Under Zuffa LLC and later TKO Group Holdings has systematically suppressed fighter pay through what legal experts call monopolistic practices. In simple terms, that means using their dominant market position to artificially limit what fighters can earn, regardless of the revenue they create. These aren't wild accusations from bitter athletes seeking revenge. The evidence comes from unsealed court documents, leaked contracts, and behind-the-scenes communications revealed through the Lee vs. Zuffa antitrust class action lawsuits, cases filed by over 2,000 former fighters accusing the UFC of antitrust violations to suppress pay and trap athletes in restrictive exclusive contracts that severely limited their bargaining power and earning potential. Here's where things get really troubling. In December 2023, a Nevada judge ordered Dana White himself to testify under oath about gaps in produced records related to fighter pay discussions and contract data. The order specifically mentioned data from White's personal cell phones, suggesting the court had serious concerns about communications that may have been destroyed or withheld. Let that sink in. The CEO of the Ultimate Fighting Championship was ordered by a federal judge to testify about potential missing evidence, including data from his personal devices, in a case involving over 1,000 fighters claiming they were systematically underpaid for years. The settlements tell their own story. In February 2023, a $37.5 million settlement was approved. That sounds impressive until you realize how many fighters had to split it and how much the UFC has profited over the years. After legal fees and distribution, the average payout was about $231,000, with a median of just 8 for years of alleged underpayment, for careers spent generating billions for the organization, for sacrificing their bodies and long-term health. The highest payout went to Anderson Silva at roughly $10.3 million, a legend who generated countless times more than that for the UFC during his dominant run. These numbers paint a stark picture of where UFC fighters stand compared to other professional athletes. The average UFC fighter makes approximately $150,000 compared to nearly $11 million for Formula One drivers, almost $11 million for NBA players, and even $51,000 for professional boxers at the bottom of that sport's pay scale. Remember that UFC average is heavily skewed by the handful of top earners like Conor McGregor and Israel Adesanya. The reality for most fighters is much worse. But now I have to go fight again, immediately. What you just heard shows the brutal financial reality facing UFC fighters early in their careers. Make $12,000 for risking your body and brain, give half to your team and taxes, and suddenly you're looking at jumping back into training camp right away just to survive. There's no recovery time, no healing from injuries, no financial safety net. It's an endless cycle of violence and poverty for most fighters. That was Israel Adesanya, one of the UFC's biggest stars and reportedly one of its highest paid fighters, calling heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou's compensation atrocious. According to multiple reports, Adesanya publicly supported Ngannou's fight for better pay and praised Jake Paul for highlighting the issue. When your own top earners are publicly criticizing how you pay other champions, something has gone fundamentally wrong. The Francis Ngannou situation perfectly shows everything broken about UFC fighter pay. After becoming heavyweight champion, arguably the most prestigious title in combat sports, Ngannou held out for better contract terms, only to be offered a deal that reportedly included restrictive clauses preventing him from pursuing boxing opportunities. When he rejected the offer and left the organization, he was stripped of his title. His history with the UFC has reportedly been minimized or erased in subsequent promotions. Adesanya himself called out the UFC for trying to whitewash Ngannou from the record books, saying, "We need to fix this. I don't like that we're trying to cut out a really important part of history." The favoritism allegations that Strickland has made against the organization go beyond just pay. He's directly accused White of giving Adesanya privileges that other fighters don't get. The most obvious example, after Adesanya was knocked out by Alex Pereira, he got an immediate rematch, but when Strickland lost a razor-close split decision to Dricus du Plessis, a fight that White himself reportedly thought Strickland won, no rematch was offered. The message was crystal clear: certain fighters are protected, others are disposable. So what happens next, and why does it matter? This fighter pay conflict isn't just about Sean Strickland, Israel Adesanya, or Dana White as individuals. It's about the fundamental question of how value should be distributed in professional combat sports and whether the current system can survive mounting pressure from athletes, fans, legal challenges, and public scrutiny. One underappreciated aspect of this entire saga is how the Strickland-Adesanya rivalry has actually impacted UFC business in unexpected ways. On the surface, you'd think public criticism of fighter pay would hurt the organization, but here's the twist nobody saw coming. UFC 293 became one of the most memorable events in recent history, precisely because of the upset and surrounding drama. The controversy drove engagement, sparked conversations, and put eyes on the product. The middleweight division experienced complete revitalization after Strickland's victory. Suddenly, fans who'd grown bored watching Adesanya dominate were engaged again. The subsequent matchups, Strickland versus Duplessis, Adesanya's comeback attempts, all drew significant attention precisely because the narrative had become so compelling, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. Israel Adesanya makes a crucial point in that clip that needs to be repeated. The UFC markets itself as the premier organization in combat sports, the NBA of fighting, as he puts it. But NBA rookies get guaranteed contracts worth millions from day one. They don't need second jobs. They don't have to scrape together pennies for training camps. The gap between how the UFC positions itself and how it actually pays its athletes is becoming impossible to justify. External pressure on the UFC keeps building from multiple directions. Jake Paul, whatever you think of him, has successfully drawn massive attention to fighter pay issues through his public battles with Dana White. Paul's campaign highlighted that no major sports organization pays its athletes as poorly as the UFC. And while his motives may be self-serving, the platform he provides is valuable. Competitors like the PFL have tried offering better terms to attract talent, and ongoing antitrust litigation continues exposing internal documents that paint an unflattering picture of UFC operations for decades. The question of what comes next hangs over everything. As of early 2024, no major structural changes to the UFC's pay model have been reported, despite settlements, lawsuits, and public outcry. Dana White has consistently said fighter pay won't change dramatically under his leadership. Bonuses, while occasionally increased for special events, have generally stayed at $50,000 for Fight and Performance of the Night awards. What you just heard was Sean Strickland reflecting on his incredible journey, acknowledging he's reached financial security, while making clear the path there was brutal and filled with trauma. This, more than any statistic or legal document, captures what's really at stake in this compensation debate. Strickland didn't just fight his way to a championship. He survived a childhood marked by trauma, violence, and instability that would have destroyed most people. In emotional interviews, he's detailed abuse, homeschooling due to behavioral problems, getting kicked out of school, being an angry young man, searching for identity, and finding and fighting a way to channel pain that might have destroyed him completely. When he finally reached the top of his sport, when he accomplished something only a handful of humans ever achieve, he discovered the system valued his contributions at a fraction of what it generated from his work. This fighter pay debate isn't just about contract numbers, percentages, revenue splits, and corporate profits. It's about how we as a society value human beings who put their bodies and minds on the line for our entertainment. It's about whether an organization that has made billions has any moral obligation to share that wealth more fairly with the people who actually step into the octagon and risk everything. Looking toward the future, several key developments deserve attention. Antitrust litigation continues, with the Johnson case still ongoing, covering fighters from 2017 onward. However, the UFC has added arbitration clauses and class action waivers to newer fighter contracts, potentially blocking future collective legal action. TKO Group Holdings, the parent company following the merger with WWE, faces pressure to address fighter compensation across both organizations, and a new generation of fighters, inspired by the outspokenness of Strickland, Ngannou, and others, seems increasingly willing to advocate publicly for better terms. What are your thoughts on the UFC fighter pay situation? Drop your comments below and check out the related videos for more coverage.